Episode 8. Agony, Betrayal, and Arrest. All four Gospels share the same basic outline for the narrative of what happened next. After the Last Supper, Jesus goes with his disciples to a location outside Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. Judas brings a detachment of guards and representatives of the priestly rulers of Jerusalem. There is a brief, violent confrontation in which the high priest's servant has his ear cut off. Then the disciples escape, leaving Jesus under arrest. Jesus is taken back to the city, to the house of one of the priestly families, and is interrogated there. Peter follows at a distance and waits in the courtyard of the high priest with the servants. These recognize him as a follower of Jesus, but each time they claim to identify him, he denies all knowledge of Jesus. When a cock crows, he remembers that Jesus had told him, during their Last Supper, that he would deny him in this way. After the interrogation by the chief priests, Jesus is taken in the morning to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The chief priests present him as an insurrectionary who has claimed to be king of the Jews. Pilate moves to release him, but fails. There is a scene where the Jerusalem crowd choose the release of Barabbas over Jesus, and voices demand that Jesus be crucified. Jesus is handed over to the executioners, taken outside the city, and crucified. The clarity of this outline suggests that there was already a well-established narrative by the time of the Gospel writers. However, within that basic narrative, there are differences across the four Gospels. Some of them are quite subtle, and some of them are more structural. The differences remind us that we are not simply reading an historical drama of human cruelty and political injustice. We are reading an account of events laden with theological meaning for author and reader. What happens is according to the will of God. Mysteriously, that will is a saving will for humankind, even though the road to salvation passes through the torture and death of the innocent Jesus, Messiah and Son of God. Each Gospel author offers subtly different highlighting and interpretation of the meaning of the Passion. Let's begin with Mark. Mark's Jesus throughout the Gospel has shown the biggest range of human emotions, including anger and grim determination. Now we see fear. Jesus goes to the Garden of the Olive Presses, Gethsemane, to await the inevitable. He knows that Judas is on the way. Nevertheless, he leaves the main group of his disciples and goes to pray alone with just Peter, James, and John as witnesses. Mark portrays Jesus as almost out of his mind with fear, panic-stricken. Matthew and Luke noticeably tone down the language for their audience. For them, he is simply distressed. He tells the disciples that his soul is cast down to the point of death. The reader will recognize a hint of Psalms 42 and 43, a clue that even in the midst of this very human fear, prophecy is being fulfilled. We listen in on Jesus' prayer. He calls on God as Father in the common language of the people, Abba, Father. He prays for release from the coming horror, make this cup pass me by. But it is balanced by a prayer of faithful obedience. Not my will, but yours. The scene focuses on the agony of a human dilemma that Mark's persecuted Christian readers can readily identify with. But it also makes a theological point. It reveals the true humanity of Jesus, embracing the will of the Father. And that is important. If Jesus had not really been human, then his death could have no saving power for humankind. Because he is truly human, his hard-won sacrifice of the will has meaning and power for all people. The letter to the Hebrews, which explores Jesus' sacrifice and what it achieves, teases out the implications of this moment in the story. In his days on earth, he offered prayer and supplication with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. However, even though he was the Son, he learnt obedience through suffering. The point for the author of the letter is that Jesus is the true high priest who is able to suffer with us in our weakness, who is put to the test in every way like us, but without sinning. Precisely for this reason, we can take courage and approach the throne of grace. Now, in John's account of the arrest, Jesus shows no sign of wavering. However, we do witness a version of this same moment of weakness earlier in his gospel, as Jesus speaks to the crowd in Jerusalem just before the Passover. John, too, recognizes this as a theologically significant moment. Now my soul is distressed. What am I to say? Father, save me from this hour. But that is why I came, for this hour. However, in John, after this momentary wobble, he invokes the glory of God, and he is met with a voice from heaven, I glorify my name, I shall glorify it. There is no sign of that glory in Mark and Matthew's Gethsemane, however, as Jesus prays 3 times alone, and 3 times comes back to find his disciples asleep. They are covered with confusion when roused, and Jesus tells them to pray not to be put to the test. The tense mood of grief and fearful expectation is broken as the detachment of guards from the chief priests appears, armed with swords and clubs, and led by Judas. Mark has Judas identify Jesus out of the crowd of disciples. He goes up to Jesus, says, Master, and kisses him. There seems to be calculated passive aggression in the gesture. A backstory of disappointed expectations, perhaps? Matthew and Luke each add a response from Jesus. Matthew emphasizes Jesus' control over the situation. My friend, do what you came for. Luke emphasizes the cruel irony. You betray the Son of Man with a kiss? John gives us a very different version of the moment of arrest. Jesus has led his disciples across the Kedron Valley to the Mount of Olives. As ever, John's geographical details are more precise than the others. There is no soul searching by Jesus at this point. When Judas leads the detachment to the familiar spot, Jesus knows exactly what is happening and takes control of the situation. He steps out towards them and says, Who are you looking for? The answer comes back, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replies, I am he. The phrase is used with deliberate ambiguity throughout John's Gospel. It carries a significant and deliberate echo of the moment in Exodus, where the Lord reveals himself to Moses as, I am who am. At this, apparently most vulnerable moment, Jesus is in charge and reveals his true identity. And his declaration has a dramatically appropriate effect. His opponents shrink back and fall to the ground. Only when he asks a second time, and they reply as before, does he surrender himself, asking only that they let the others go. In all the Gospels, as the guards lay hands on Jesus, violence breaks out. One of the disciples draws a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Luke has taken care to lay the ground for this earlier in his narrative. The disciples have already presented weapons to Jesus during the supper. Perhaps not so surprising given the political realities and tensions. John is very specific about the incident. He names the disciple, Simon Peter himself, specifies the ear, the right ear, and names the servant as Malchus. As he orders Peter to put away his sword, Jesus then asks, Am I not to drink the cup which the Father has given me? What is this cup that Jesus speaks of, now in all four Gospel writers? If we follow the trail of Tanakh references, the phrase takes us to Isaiah 51. The people have experienced God's anger and the agony of conquest by their enemies. In Isaiah's metaphor, they have drunk the cup of God's wrath, the cup of stupor. Now, the Isaiah passage does look forward to a time when the cup will be removed, but in the moment, they are experiencing the real-world pain and suffering of God's judgment. So this word of Jesus tells us that it is he who must drink the cup of God's judgment. In the words of the servant song of Isaiah 53, he must be taken for a sinner in order to save sinners. Matthew's Jesus asks a similar rhetorical question. Jesus could summon legions of angels if he wanted. But if God were to send those legions of angels, how then would the scriptures be fulfilled? But Matthew's Jesus also adds a warning about violence. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Those words will be particularly powerful for Jews and Jewish Christians who have lived through the brutal aftermath of the Jewish revolt against the Romans. Luke rounds off the incident rather differently. As so often, he highlights Jesus' role as healer and reconciler. Jesus tells the disciples to let it be, and in an act of mercy, heals the servant's ear. We'll see similar distinctive touches, emphasizing Jesus as merciful reconciler later in Luke's account of the Passion. Luke's Jesus, before he is led off, adds another theological layer to the narrative as he says, "This is your hour and the dominion of darkness." We can recognize the language of a cosmic power struggle between dark and light, familiar in the theology of the Qumran Jewish groups, but also very much a feature of John's Gospel. In Mark and Matthew, once the disciples realize that they are not allowed to struggle, they run away. Mark includes the graphic detail of a young man wrapped only in a cloth who runs away naked when they seize him by the garment. Matthew drops that detail. Perhaps he regards it as an unseemly distraction from the narrative. But why does Mark include it? Is it a vivid memory passed on by a witness to the chaos of that moment? That's certainly possible. Or does it have a symbolic significance? We've seen that in Mark there is a close interplay between the disciple as reader and the disciple of the narrative. If Mark is writing for a Christian community that has been faced with violence and death, some will indeed have run away. Does the lost garment represent a lost baptismal robe, or even the loss of protection in the afterlife? Suggestively, the Greek word for the garment, sindon, often refers to the material used for wrapping corpses. As ever, we do not know exactly what Mark might have meant, but the Gospel text still invites us to explore the space around the words. The disciples, at any rate, run away in panic, and only Peter is left hanging on in there, following the armed group at a safe distance.